Why did your brain choose this video? What made your brain want to watch it? But wait, do these questions even make sense? Do brains make choices? Do brains have desires? Some have argued that these questions rest on a fallacy. In this video, we'll lay out their argument and why it might matter. But first, what is the fallacy? It's called the Mereological Fallacy. Philosopher Ram Hari defines the Mereological Fallacy as, quote, the mistake of attributing psychological features of people to their brains or any part of their human body. Mereology is the philosophical or logical study of parts and the wholes that they form. So if we attribute something to a part of a person that can only really be attributed to the whole person, then that's a Mereological fallacy. The Mereological fallacy is not uncommon. People often attribute activities and functions to parts of an organism that should really only be ascribed to the whole organism. For example, we often see headlines like, quote, how the brain handles modern life, or, quote, your brain plays tricks on you, or, quote, how the brain tells things apart. But strictly speaking, a brain can't tell things apart, play tricks, or handle life. Only a person can. So why is it a problem that we often say brains are doing things that only people can do? It might be that such claims just don't make sense. Some philosophers make this point by analogy. Hari argues, quote, if the meaning of the word suffer is used to predicate some disagreeable psychological state to a person, then it cannot be used to attribute that state to any part of the person. This precludes attributing pains to hands as much as it does consciousness to brains. Hands may be involved in sensations of pain, for example, if you touch a hot stove, just like the brain is probably involved in generating consciousness. But attributing these psychological capacities to hands or to brains themselves seems bizarre at best. It's probably not brains or hands that experience things like pain, it's people. So parts of us, like our brains or hands, can be involved in psychological processes even if those processes cannot be meaningfully attributed to those parts. Philosophers have been making this point for millennia. Aristotle writes, quote, to say that the soul is feeling angry is like saying the soul is weaving or building. For presumably it is better not to say that the soul is feeling pity or learning or thinking, but rather that the human being is doing so by means of his soul. Goerge Henry Lewes argues, quote, it is the man and not the brain that thinks. It is the organism as a whole and not one organ that feels and acts. And Wittgenstein claims, quote, only of a living human being, and what resembles a living human being, can one say, it has sensations, it sees, is blind, hears, is deaf, is conscious, or unconscious. Nevertheless, there is a debate about the Mereological fallacy. Not everyone agrees that it is, in fact, a fallacy. Philosopher Carrie Figdor is one of the skeptics. After all, she points out, mechanistic psychological explanations often involve only part of a person. For example, quote, a monkey learns to swing through the trees by grabbing and releasing vines, and presynaptic neurons in the monkey's hippocampus release glutamate in the process of long-term potentiation, theorized to be a mechanism of learning, end quote. So it may just be that, quote, cognitive capacities are just as apt as any other type of capacity for being ascribed to both wholes and their parts, at least in principle. Indeed, neuroscience is rife with terms which imply that some part of people, or their brains, performs some kind of psychological function. Consider, for example, mirror neurons, visual word form area, and salivatory nucleus. Are all of these names really committing the Mereological fallacy? There are surely situations in which we would be wrong to attribute psychological capacities to body parts. Hands don't suffer. Hearts don't feel. But maybe there are situations in which it is perfectly reasonable to attribute a psychological function or mechanism to a body part, such as a part or region of the brain. So not every psychological attribution to a body part commits a mereological fallacy, but some do. The difficulty is clearly articulating the difference in a way that allows us to sort all fallacious psychological claims about body parts from non-fallacious psychological claims about body parts. This remains an open challenge for philosophers of mind and neuroscientists, and maybe for you, too, if your brain is interested in philosophy.